It's time for the Since the Sandbox Fantasy Rankings. First episode going to give you guys the quarterbacks, the tight ends. Draft times are coming up. We're not wasting any time on this episode. We're getting right into it. We're going to start things off with the tight end. Let's keep in mind, this isn't Matthew Berry's list. This isn't Field Yates' list. This is Steve Tauro's list on Since the Sandbox. It's my list. I created this way. Thank you guys for tuning in. Let's win a fantasy league together. I'm going to start things off on the back end of the tight end, starting here with 10. At 10 for the tight end fantasy rankings, going to start with TJ Hawkinson, who has absolutely been a consistent fantasy tight end over the past couple seasons. We just heard that JJ McCarthy will be out for the season, so now his fantasy opportunities are left in the hands of Sam Darnold. I'm not too confident on that. We've seen his ADP and his draft stock really fall significantly compared to Kirk Cousins being there last year. Let's keep in mind, JJ is there. I know Addison got a little bit banged up in the preseason, but Hawkinson should still be a trustworthy option, a little bit more of the bigger name. I think this is a position where you're going to see, a lot of back-end value. I think Hawkinson's a guy that you can draft and just have a little bit less expectations in the past couple seasons. At 9, this is where I have Kyle Pitts. I think the upside this year might be a little bit higher, having TJ Hawkinson's quarterback and Kirk Cousins going over there. And realistically, I can't trust Darnell Mooney as a second receiving option. You obviously got Drake London, who proved last year that he can be a very serviceable wide receiver. I would say fringe wide receiver too. Last year maybe played a little bit more closer to that top tier. But this is a guy whose draft stock is going to significantly depend on the quarterback play for the Atlanta Falcons. Kyle Pitts should see improved targets, should see improved receptions. That should mean getting in the end zone a little bit more often. If he catches around 600-700 yards, that's still pretty productive for a tight end, but we obviously want to see him get a little bit higher with all the hype that surrounded his name. I mean, this guy was a top 10 pick in the NFL draft, so Kyle Pitts is definitely a name that's going to have high expectations. I think anytime after round 8 is the range where Kyle Pitts could be selected, could be a bargain if the Falcons end up panning out. 8, this is where I have Jake Ferguson. There's not too many receiving threats for the Dallas Cowboys. I think we saw last year him and Dak just starting to get, established. Pollard took a lot of receptions out of the backfield with Zeke there. I feel like that's not going to be the case this year. You got Cooks. CD's holding out right now. This is a guy you might be able to get a little bit later that could have some really great value. I like to draft a couple of tight ends, 2, 3, and play matchups. Ferguson's one of those guys. Him and Schultz. Dalton Schultz is not on the list this year. But just some guys I feel like could have a couple of good weeks and not really relying on that consistent fantasy play. 7, a little bit lower on the list. I think that this is a circumstantial positioning. Got to see the way everything works out in San Francisco. But this is where I have George Kittle. This is a guy that we've seen have less and less receptions, but still make a shit ton of plays with it. Last year, around 50 to 60 catches, still sniffing 1,000 yards, but the touchdown numbers were a little bit back compared to the year prior. George Kittle's always going to give you those games where you get 2, 3 touchdowns, you get a couple of times throughout the season, and he's going to win you a week for sure. But I just think there's a lot of options there. You got McCaffrey, who we saw was extremely involved in the offense. Ayuk, Debo, you're drafting 2 rookie receivers. Pearsall, who's absolutely been killing it, throughout preseason. So I'm just feeling a little bit wary about, George Kittle. If I'm not going to get more than 3, 4 receptions a game, it's tough to rely on my fantasy tight end to continue to put up those numbers for me. At 6, in that same division, we saw this guy jump up to the scene last year as a rookie. This is Trey McBride, and I feel like this is a little bit lower than where most people are really having him going. Some people have him in the top 3, some people in the top 5. This is just outside. I think there's some great receiving options. You got MHJ, Marvin Harrison. The Cardinals really like Michael Wilson, who proved himself a little bit last year. And, McBride and Kyler Murray really hit it off very quickly. We saw Zach Ertz's role kind of became diminished with McBride really picking up the slack there. So I think McBride is a guy that has upside. Gives me a very similar feel to like an Evan Ingram. A bunch of receptions, high number on the yardage, but we'll see how many times he really gets in the end zone. I think you could draft McBride with confidence. 5, this is where I have Mark Andrews coming off of an injury. Lamar Jackson's number one option. Let's keep that in mind. I know we're talking about, a guy that's a little bit older in his career, but we've seen him overcome adversity time and time again. And I think this is a guy that's really heavy on the touchdown numbers. Goal line package. They're running the jumbo. You're going to see Derrick Henry in there. Yeah, Lamar might run some into the end zone, but if there's anyone that's going to be getting a pass out of play action, it's going to be Mark Andrews. And I kind of feel like Isaiah likely isn't going to be taking, much from his role. If anything, they like playing the 12 personnel, putting 2 tight ends out there. Mark Andrews is still the guy to have until proven otherwise. 4, right above him, this might be a shocker for some people. This is where I have Evan Ingram. We saw how many receptions he had last year and where he really grew in that offense. No Calvin Ridley. I expect big years out of Evan Ingram and Christian Kirk for the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think it might take some time for Brian Thomas to really get acclimated in that offense. But you're talking about a down the field burner, deep threat type of dude. You get Travis Etienne to beat you in the middle. And don't forget about Gabe Davis, because they're going to be using him a lot. I still feel like Evan Ingram's going to be the guy to get 6 or 7 catches. Might not be crazy on the touchdown numbers, but in PPR leagues, this guy is a diamond in the rough. At 3, this might be my most bold take at the tight end position. This is where I have Dalton Kincaid. I don't know how he's so down on the top 300s in the positional sheets. I really think Dalton Kincaid is going to have a breakout year. He caught 70 plus passes last year, and it was his rookie year, and he didn't get acclimated until after about week 4. So now that we're talking about a full season, off season under his belt, no Stephon Diggs, I think this is going to be a receiving option for Josh Allen that's going to continue to grow, expand his role. I think this is going to be one of the best tight ends in the NFL, Dalton Kincaid. 2 and 1, I'm sure you guys are not surprised. I have Sam Laporta as my number 1 tight end this year, and I have Travis Kelce at 2. I think these guys are interchangeable in those positionings. I think the things you want to worry about with Travis Kelce is he's a little bit older in age, but we didn't see, the crazy production last year after he was getting drafted in the first round in most fantasy leagues, and then not really have, the touchdown and the production numbers on the second half of the season. But then you see the playoffs come around, and it's like Travis Kelce's back. It's kind of crazy how he disappeared in the regular season. In the playoffs, he came back. But after seeing Sam Laporta burst out to the scene, I know they have Amon-Ra up in Detroit. Gibbs is going to catch the ball. Jameson Williams is a guy that's expected to have a larger role. But Laporta really had that breakout ability. He did that last year. We're going to see where that continues to grow and develop. My whole thing with Kelce and Laporta, I think their ADP is too high. I'm just telling and sharing my draft strategy. I do not draft a tight end, above around a 6 or a 7 or anything like that. I like filling out my running backs, my wide receivers, making sure I have starters, and not only that, but a quality bench threat in case injuries happen. And that's why I draft tight ends and quarterbacks in bulk. Look, I feel like I can get value at the quarterback position because realistically, there's about 16 guys that can put up 15 plus fantasy points a week. And then with the tight ends, I just feel like the days of the tight ends, really dominating and being extreme difference makers in the position in fantasy football. And I think things are just changing. I wouldn't draft Kelce or Sam Laporta where they're being selected. I might stay off at Andrews as well. But find me with that value a little bit later, a Kincaid, even Kittle, if he gets drafted in round 9, that's a great value there. You got guys like Pat Freiermuth and Dalton Schultz, who I feel like aren't going to be big name guys at the tight end position, but could give you some solid weeks. So if you package those guys with some on the list, feel like you have a pretty solid tight end room. If you guys have questions about the fantasy tight end position, where you should target them, or some guys back end on the list like Darnell Washington, who I feel like could be a real sleeper in some deep leagues, message us on the podcast, text the show. We'll answer your questions live on air and give you guys the best answer to help win your fantasy league. We're going to move over to our quarterback position. All right, for the quarterbacks, we're going to break things down in tiers, and then I'm going to go 18 to 1, giving you guys my rankings. My fantasy QB1s for this season, the 2024 season, only have 3 guys in that conversation. Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson. Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson obviously having the rushing ability. I feel like they can be consistent, dual threats at that position and give you a shit ton of fantasy points. And look, I know Patrick Mahomes had a little bit of a down year last year when it comes to fantasy points and winning games. Obviously still being the world champions, winning the Super Bowl. If there's a quarterback you're selecting in the NFL to start a franchise tomorrow, it's going to be Patrick Mahomes. But keeping all that in mind, I still think Patrick Mahomes is a QB1 when it comes to fantasy football. The next part of the conversation, I feel like, is QB2. It's a very familiar names on the list. They have the potential to be that QB1, but there are some question marks, some injury history. I'm going to start things off with the top of my QB2 list is Anthony Richardson. We heard the potential from this guy this year. Some people are talking about this guy being the potential number one fantasy quarterback for the season. I think you'll be able to get him at a little bit more of a value, but you have to keep in mind the injury questions that surround his name. Same thing with this guy next, Joe Burrow. Obviously, some injury history here, but being paired up with Jamar Chase, this offense is expected to score points, be on top of that division, and supposed to be the big bullies in the AFC that are going to knock the Chiefs off that top spot. 5 more guys part of this conversation. Next on the list, another guy with the big running ability. This is where I have Jalen Hurts. We saw the arm numbers, like the passing yards and the touchdowns, dwindle a little bit last year, and that might have been on the back stretch, where they dropped 6 straight, and we're dealing with, a lot of adversity. Is that between Nick Sirianni and Jalen Hurts? Is that A.J. Brown demanding his role in the offense? There's a lot of factors and things that we don't know, but Kellen Moore is coming in there as the new OC, and things are going to change in that offense. Adding Saquon Barkley, I'm not sure if that's going to help or hurt Jalen Hurts' rushing ability, but Saquon is going to demand the ball, so that's why I have Hurts a little bit more back, but right after Burrow. The next two I feel like are in a very competitive conversation, C.J. Stroud and Jordan Love. I'm more of a Jordan Love guy, if you want me to be honest, but I know C.J. Stroud has the big wide receiver room and the higher expectations going into year 2. Adding Stephon Diggs, a healthy Tank Dell back. Nico Collins has continued to evolve and grow. You got Schultz. You add Joe Mixon, who I feel like is going to be a great fit in Houston. But honestly, with Jordan Love, their running back room improved. No more Aaron Jones, and you have 2 quality backs. Obviously, Josh Jacobs, I feel like, can be a top-tier fantasy running back, but we'll talk about that in the next episode. And you have 4 or 5 guys in that wide receiver room can really catch balls. You got Christian Watson, who was a top-round pick. Romeo Doubs, who I feel like is being significantly undervalued in all fantasy formats. Jaden Reed, we saw burst onto the scene. I feel like is more of like that Percy Harvin type of gadget skill set, but we saw was very consistent, very productive. And Dontavian Wicks, who won games for fantasy players last year, especially when it came down to later in the season in the playoffs. So that's a room that even if they have an injury, there's plenty of wide receivers to go around. And Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave are 2 up-and-coming tight ends that just missed the tight end positioning rankings, but I feel like those guys could be in that Freiermuth Schultz type of conversation that you could stream. You might be able to get way later, but could still add value to your team later on. The last couple guys in this conversation, Dak Prescott and Kyler Murray. Dak is a guy that was on top of the fantasy rankings last year, absolutely balled out through so many passes to CeeDee Lamb, and we saw that production, complement both of their fantasy numbers. But there's a lot of controversy and drama with Dallas and going into the season. There's contract questions with Dak. There's contract questions with CD. Can Brandon Cooks still be, a wide receiver too? There's questions there, and I don't know if they really surrounded themselves with a successful ground game plan. Last year, Zeke was a guy that was expendable for them, and they let him walk to New England. And now the year later, they're getting rid of the guy they invested in Tony Pollard, and now Zeke is back in it. So it's just a little head-scratching to me. I do think that the Eagles and the Cowboys are guys that are going to, take some steps back. I'm not saying that these are going to be bad football teams by any means, but might be closer to that 9-10 win range rather than that 12-13 win range for those guys. And Kyler Murray's here, the back end of my QB2 list. Honestly feel like Kyler can sneak himself into that top 5 conversation. Depends on McBride's health. Depends on how MHJ really finds a role in that offense and what he demands as far as targets and receptions. And we'll see what happens with the ground game too. Is James Conner going to come in and still be a successful back, or are we going to have to wait a little bit later to, get a guy like Benson who could come in and absolutely steal the show for that offense, completing them as a whole? I have questions about the offensive line and sometimes Kyler Murray's leadership and decision making, but still enough to be consistent in the fantasy quarterback rankings. Gameplay and skill set is also going to play a large part into this. Are the Cardinals playing from behind in a lot of these games? Are they playing with a lead? Is it garbage times touchdowns? All of that has to go into consideration when it comes to the quarterback position and those fantasy numbers. In this next range, this next tier, I'd say is my QB3 tier. This isn't saying that you're drafting 3 quarterbacks as part of your roster. Just think that we have to value and position these guys differently based on expectations with fantasy points to help build your team and not worry about this around week 5, week 6 when you're fully understanding who your team is. This is the range of quarterbacks I target in my fantasy leagues when I select a quarterback and try and find a guy with great value, a diamond in the rough, and can really help me win with a later round pick. Starting things off on the list, I'm going to go with a rookie. My first rookie on the list, Jaden Daniels. I think this guy is going to be a league winner. I'm a Giants fan. This is not something I'm boasting about. This is a guy I wanted the Giants to trade for. Didn't happen. I think the skill set is tremendous. Passed on more yards than Joe Burrow in one season at LSU. Still had great wide receivers coming into the league with a new coach in Dan Quinn, a new OC in Cliff Kingsbury, a veteran wide receiver, Terry McLaurin, and Jahan Dotson in that category as well. You add a pass catching back in Austin Eckler. Zach Ertz is a guy at the tight end position who has tremendous experience, has been part of winning a championship. That's all going to help the development of Jaden Daniels. This is the guy I'm targeting in all my leagues. So if you're in a league with me, you might want to draft him before I do because I think this guy's going to be a QB1 by the time the end of the year is done. Jaden Daniels starting off the list. 12 right behind him, Aaron Rodgers. I just think, the injury questions are serious. They're legit. It's the New York Jets. I haven't seen anything successful happen there in quite some time. Vin, I'm not picking on Rodgers or the Jets, I promise you, but it's just kind of, I want to wait and see. We know that if Rodgers is healthy with Garrett Wilson and, a healthy Mike Williams, Breece Hall catches balls out of the backfield, that this team could be a serious threat in the AFC, for top 3 seed. Like, that's no joke. But it just kind of has to come to play. And, there could be some serious questions about Robert Saleh, too. Is the defensive guy going to be able to get the best out of, this veteran quarterback who had some complications in Green Bay towards the back end? Where is Aaron Rodgers at mentally? This is usually at a point in time in the season where we get, that check-in. Is Rodgers invested? Is he helping those guys on his team? We saw that little spat with Garrett Wilson, but I just think that's competitive juices flowing, trying to figure out how to be great at the position. So I'm not worried about that too much. Feel confident in Rodgers this year. My next couple guys, Brock Purdy, Caleb Williams, Tua, Justin Herbert, Jared Goff, and Matthew Stafford. I'm going to talk about just a couple of these guys. I think Caleb Williams definitely has some upside and potential. I would just be a little bit wary. There has not been, a Bears rookie quarterback that has had a successful year one, above 3,500 yards. I know that's not a lot of yards, and Caleb is expected to shatter that with the wide receiver core he has. But I just kind of want to wait and see. Things with the Chicago Bears haven't worked out. This was the same expectation for Justin Fields, and it just didn't come to fruition. So let's keep that in mind. I like Tua, obviously, with Tyreek Hill there, that helps his value. This was a guy that led the NFL in passing yards last year, so I am expecting him to continue to grow. I think his relationship with Jalen Waddle and Odell Beckham should come to fruition this year, and we'll see how well-rounded that group is. Mostert's back, Achan's back, year 2 in Mike McDaniel's offensive scheme, so that should all really work out, especially for the value going on here. On this back end, though, Justin Herbert, I know he just got cleared to come back to the playing field, but dealing with plantar fascia right before the season isn't something that I feel so excited about, especially knowing that his wide receiver His wide receiver room was stripped, was depleted, and this offense is going to ground and pound. They brought J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards in to be the focal point of that offense along with Greg Roman, and I feel like we're going to see, a more improved Chargers team going into next year once they have a better understanding of what their current roster is and where they need to improve. Brock Purdy's still a solid option. Where I have him might be a little bit low for him, but we're going to go down the list 18-1 right now. 18 is where I have Matthew Stafford. 17, Jared Goff. That could be a little bit low. 16, Justin Herbert. 15, Tua. 14, Caleb Williams. 13, Brock Purdy. 12, Aaron Rodgers. And right outside that top 10, wrapping up the QB3 list, is where I have Jaden Daniels at 11. Getting into the top 10, our QB2 list, Kyler Murray at 10, Dak Prescott at 9, Jordan Love at 8, CJ Stroud at 7, Jalen Hurts at 6, Joe Burrow at 5, and Anthony Richardson just outside that QB1 list at 4. I really think the Colts are going to have a big year. I think they're going to make, some noise in that AFC South, and I actually think that they could be division winners as long as this guy stays healthy. We'll see. A.D. Mitchell, big pickup. Big pickup. I got you, Lou. And rounding out the top, Lamar Jackson 3, Pat Mahomes 2, and Josh Allen 1. I think this really could be an MVP season for Josh Allen, as long as that wide receiver room can really help him out. We saw last year they got hurt, they got depleted. We didn't really know what was going on with that whole Stephon Diggs scenario, so we'll see what happens. But this was my fantasy tight ends, fantasy quarterbacks. Like I said, not Phil Yates, not Matthew Berry. This is Steve Tauro and Since the Sandbox fantasy rankings. Next, we're going to be getting you guys the running backs and the wide receivers. I know draft days are starting this weekend. Make sure you guys are tuning in, getting the best from the list. And let's make sure we're creating a lot of league winners this year. You guys know the deal. Peace, love, 5 stars, nothing less.